The alarm bells screamed through the crystalline corridors of Coalition Command Station Alpha. Admiral Corval pressed his 4 hands against the tactical display, watching the red dots spread across the star map like a disease. Each red dot represented another world consumed by the enemy. "How many ships do we have left?" Corval asked his aide, Lieutenant Zena. His voice carried the weight of defeat that all Coalition officers had grown to recognize. 43 battle cruisers and maybe 200 smaller vessels, Zena replied, her blue skin pale with exhaustion. 3 months ago we had over 800 ships. Corval's eyes closed. The enemy called themselves the Devourers, and the name fit perfectly. They consumed everything in their path. Planets, space stations, entire solar systems vanished into their endless hunger. Their ships looked like giant insects made of metal and flesh, and they fought with the single-minded purpose of a hive. "Sir, incoming transmission from the Kepler Defense Fleet," Communications Officer Bren announced from his station. His tentacles moved quickly across the control panel, but Corval could see the fear in his movements. The main screen flickered to life, showing Admiral Thex aboard her command ship. Behind her, explosions lit up the bridge as her ship shuddered under enemy fire. "Coalition Command, this is Admiral Thex. The Devourers have broken through our outer defenses. We estimate 60,000 enemy vessels. Repeat, 60,000. The bridge fell silent. Corval had never heard of a fleet that large. The entire Coalition Navy at full strength barely reached 15,000 ships. "Admiral, how long can you hold?" Corval asked. "Maybe 6 hours if we're lucky. These things don't fight like anything we've faced. They don't care about losses. They just keep coming." An explosion rocked Admiral Thex's ship, and the transmission cut to static. Corval turned to his senior staff. Around the circular command center stood representatives from 12 different species, all part of the great coalition that had brought peace to the galaxy. Now they looked at him with the same expression animals wore when cornered by predators. "Options?" Corval asked. "We could evacuate the core worlds," suggested General Mortex, his scales shimmering with stress patterns. "Move the population centers beyond the galactic rim. And give up 2,000 years of civilization?" Defense Minister Quinn's voice rose to a shriek. "Impossible." "Then we fight," General Mortex replied. "We gather every ship, every soldier, every weapon in coalition space and make our stand." "With what?" Corval's aide Zena stepped forward. "Sir, we've thrown everything we have at them. Our best troops from the low-gravity worlds, our enhanced warriors, our newest weapons. Nothing stops them. They adapt too quickly and there are too many of them." The room buzzed with desperate conversation as each species representative offered increasingly hopeless suggestions. Corval watched them argue and felt the weight of 3 trillion lives pressing down on his shoulders. In 6 hours the Kepler system would fall. In a week the Devourers would reach the core worlds. In a month the coalition would cease to exist. A soft chime interrupted the chaos. Communications Officer Bren looked up from his console with confusion. "Sir, I'm receiving a priority message from the Archive Division." "The Archives?" Corval's confusion matched his aide's. "Put it through." The screen displayed Archivist Vel, an ancient member of the Keeper species whose job was maintaining Coalition historical records. Her voice quavered with age but carried an odd note of hope. "Admiral Corval, I have been reviewing old military files. There is something you need to know about the Terra Contingency Protocol." A collective shudder ran through the command center. Every species in the Coalition knew about Earth. That strange world on the galaxy's edge, classified as a Class 12 death world. Its inhabitants had joined the Coalition 50 years ago, eager to help defend civilized space. For 10 years, human soldiers had fought alongside Coalition forces. Then the Raider incident happened. An entire enemy fleet, 300 ships, had surrendered rather than face a single human battalion. The recordings from that battle were sealed, but rumors spread. Coalition Command quietly transferred all human military units back to Earth and established what they politely called a monitoring station around the Sol system. "Archivist Vel," Corval said carefully, "the Terra protocols were suspended indefinitely. Those people are dangerous." "Those people," Vel's voice carried strange emphasis on the word, "are exactly what we need. Admiral, I have reviewed every battle record from the human integration period. They never lost. Not once. Not even when facing impossible odds. Because they're insane," General Mortex hissed. "They treat warfare like some kind of sport. They don't follow civilized rules of engagement." "Civilized rules," Archivist Vel repeated slowly, "do not apply when facing extinction. Admiral, the Terra Defense Corps still exists. They maintain their own fleet, their own weapons, their own soldiers. They are waiting. Corval stared at the communication display. Around him, his staff exchanged fearful glances. They all knew the stories. Humans who fought like demons. Humans who never retreated. Humans who considered acceptable casualties to be whatever number achieved victory. Another alert chimed. On the tactical display, the red dots representing Devourer forces jumped forward. The Kepler system had fallen. Admiral Thex and her 60,000 defenders were gone. 6 billion people, Lieutenant Zeno whispered. 6 billion people just died. Corval looked around his command center one more time. At the faces of beings from across the galaxy, all looking to him for salvation he couldn't provide. At the tactical display showing an enemy that consumed worlds like snacks. At the communication screen showing an ancient archivist who offered him a weapon that terrified him almost as much as the enemy. How long, he asked quietly, to reach Earth? 3 days, Zeno replied. But sir, the monitoring station will let us through when they understand what's coming. Corval straightened his shoulders. Archivist Vel, prepare the Terra contingency authorization codes. All of them. The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of machinery and the distant sound of alarms from other sections of the station. Corval knew he was about to make a decision that would haunt him for whatever time the galaxy had left. He was about to wake the monsters. The message reached Luna Base at exactly 0347 hours ship time. General Michael Stone sat in his office overlooking Earth, a cup of coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. At 72 years old, he had seen more wars than most species fought in their entire history. The blue marble below looked peaceful, but Stone knew better. Earth was never truly at peace. The communication console chimed with a priority signal that hadn't been used in 20 years. Stone's aide, Colonel James Parker, burst through the office door without knocking. Sir, we have an Omega Protocol transmission from Coalition Command, Parker said, his voice tight with excitement and disbelief. Stone set down his coffee and activated the secure channel. The familiar crystalline voice of a Coalition officer filled the room, speaking words Stone never expected to hear again. Terra Defense Corps, this is Coalition Command. Omega Protocol authorized. We need you. Stone looked at Parker and saw his own thoughts reflected in the younger man's eyes. They were being called back to war. After 20 years of exile, the galaxy needed Earth's soldiers again. Parker, activate the recall signal. All personnel, all units. Tell them we're going back to work. Within minutes, Luna Base transformed from a quiet monitoring station into a hive of activity. Soldiers who had been maintaining equipment suddenly began loading it onto transport ships. Weapons that hadn't been fired in decades came out of storage, their barrels gleaming with fresh oil. Men and women who had grown comfortable with peaceful duties remembered what they were really trained for. Lieutenant Sarah Evans, 38 years old and a veteran of the corporate wars, supervised the loading of her squad's equipment. She moved with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Her soldiers, scattered across the base during their recall, arrived at the landing bay in full combat gear within 30 minutes. Ma'am, what's the situation? Asked Sergeant David Mills, checking the power cells on his pulse rifle. Mills was younger than most of the Terra Defense Corps, only 29, but he had earned his place in the underground fighting on Mars. Big one, Sergeant. Coalition's facing something they can't handle. We're going to show them how Earth solves problems. Across the base, similar scenes played out in every section. Captain Robert Hayes, 45 years old and missing 2 fingers from the asteroid mining conflicts, gathered his company in Hangar Bay 7. These weren't fresh recruits. They were survivors of humanity's bloodiest wars, soldiers who had been deemed too dangerous for Coalition service. Listen up. Hayes called to his assembled troops. We're being called back to the big show. Coalition's got an enemy they can't beat using their pretty rules of war. Time to remind the galaxy why they keep us locked up out here. The soldiers responded with grim smiles. They had volunteered for Coalition service decades ago, eager to defend civilized space. Instead, they learned that civilization had very specific ideas about acceptable warfare. Human methods were too direct, too brutal, too effective. Major Lisa Thompson walked through the equipment lockers, inspecting weapons that made Coalition observers nervous. Gravity hammers that could crush starship hulls. Molecular disruptors that Coalition treaties had banned. Kinetic accelerators that fired projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. Are we really taking all of this? Asked her aide, Lieutenant Mark Rogers. Rogers was one of the few soldiers young enough to have been born after the Terra protocols were established. He had trained with these weapons but never used them in actual combat. All of it and more, Thompson replied. The Coalition called us because their enemies don't play by civilized rules. Neither do we. General Stone made his way to the main hangar where the Terra Defense Corps was assembling. He looked out over nearly 5,000 soldiers, ranging in age from 25 to 83. These were the ones who had chosen to stay with the military after the exile. The ones who couldn't quite fit into peaceful civilian life. Sergeant Major William Cross, 78 years old and a legend even among human soldiers, stood at attention before his squad. Cross had fought in every major human conflict for the past 50 years. His left leg was mechanical, his right arm was mostly synthetic, and his face carried enough scars to tell the story of a dozen wars. Sir, Cross addressed Stone, the boys are wondering what we're up against out there. Something that's been eating Coalition fleets for breakfast, Stone replied. Something that's got them scared enough to ask for help from the monsters they locked away. The loading continued through the night. Ship after ship filled with soldiers and equipment. The Terra Defense Corps had maintained a fleet during their exile, ships designed by human engineers who understood that sometimes you had to break things beyond repair. Captain Susan Blake supervised the loading of her ship's weapons systems. Blake was 51 years old and had commanded starships in 3 different war zones. Her vessel, the Determination, looked crude compared to Coalition ships, but it was built to function in environments that would destroy more elegant designs. How long since we've been in a real fight? Asked her weapons officer, Commander Paul Anderson. Too long, Blake replied. But some things you don't forget. Like how to kill efficiently. As dawn broke over Luna Base, the last transport ship sealed its loading bay doors. General Stone stood on the command deck of his flagship, looking out at the fleet he had assembled. 18 ships carrying the most dangerous soldiers in known space. The communication console crackled with an incoming message from Coalition Command, requesting their estimated arrival time. Tell them, Stone said to his communications officer, that the cavalry is coming. The Terra Defense Corps fleet broke orbit from Luna Base and accelerated toward the jump point. Behind them, Earth continued its slow rotation, peaceful and beautiful. Ahead of them waited an enemy that had consumed worlds and a galaxy desperate enough to call for help from the soldiers they feared. The monsters were awake and they were coming to do what monsters do best. The Terra Defense Corps fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system like a pack of predators entering new hunting grounds. Admiral Corville watched from his command ship as 18 human vessels arranged themselves in formation. Their ships looked wrong compared to Coalition designs, angular, brutal, built more like weapons than transports. Sir, the human commander is requesting permission to board, Lieutenant Zena reported, her voice uncertain. Admiral Corville had reviewed every file on human military operations. The recordings were classified, but his security clearance allowed access to materials that gave him nightmares. Still, seeing the enemy firsthand was different than reading reports. Grant permission. Full diplomatic honors. The docking bay of the Coalition flagship had been prepared for a formal military greeting. Honor guards from 3 different species stood at attention. Admiral Corville waited with his senior staff, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The human transport ship attached to the docking port with mechanical precision. The airlock cycled open and General Stone stepped through. Corville's first impression was that humans looked deceptively fragile. Stone appeared to be an elderly male of his species, moving with the careful steps of advanced age. Then Corville looked closer and saw the predator beneath the civilized exterior. Stone's eyes moved constantly, cataloging every detail of the docking bay, identifying threats and exits with automatic precision. General Stone, welcome aboard, Corville said, extending his 4 arms in the traditional Coalition greeting. Admiral Corville, Stone replied, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had seen too much combat. I understand you have a problem that needs solving. Behind Stone, more humans emerged from the transport. Each one moved with the same unsettling grace, as if they were barely containing something violent beneath their calm exteriors. Captain Hayes stepped to Stone's right shoulder, his scarred hands resting casually near his sidearm. Major Thompson took position on the left, her eyes scanning the Coalition honor guard like a predator evaluating prey. Perhaps we should discuss the situation in the briefing room, Corville suggested. The briefing room filled with an uncomfortable tension as humans and Coalition officers took their seats around the holographic display. Stone listened without comment as Corville explained the enemy, their capabilities, and the extent of Coalition losses. Show me their attack patterns, Stone said when the briefing concluded. The holographic display lit up with tactical information. Red dots representing Devourer forces moved across the star map in complex formations. Coalition analysts had spent months trying to understand their strategy. Stone studied the display for exactly 30 seconds. "They're insects," he said flatly. "Hive mind, collective intelligence, predictable behavior patterns. They fight like bugs." "Sir, these beings have destroyed 3 coalition fleets," General Mortex protested. "They adapt to our tactics, overcome our technology and outnumber us 50 to 1. Stone's expression never changed. "Bugs are bugs regardless of size. The solution remains the same." "Which is?" Admiral Corval asked. "You kill the queen, you kill the hive." Stone gestured to the tactical display. "Your problem is that you've been fighting a civilized war against an enemy that doesn't understand civilization. Time to change the rules." Captain Hayes leaned forward. "Admiral, with respect, your forces have been trying to minimize casualties and preserve infrastructure. Against this enemy, that approach guarantees defeat." "What do you suggest?" Corval's aide Zena asked. "Total war," Major Thompson replied simply. "We identify their command structures and eliminate them. We deny them resources by destroying everything they might consume. We make survival so costly that even a hive mind begins to question the price." The coalition officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was exactly why humans had been exiled from military service. Their approach to warfare ignored every civilized convention. General Stone, Defense Minister Quinn spoke carefully, "Coalition military doctrine requires us to protect civilian populations and preserve planetary infrastructure. And how has that worked for you?" Stone's question carried no mockery, just professional curiosity. "How many civilian populations have you protected? How much infrastructure have you preserved?" The answer hung in the air unspoken. 6 billion dead in the Kepler system alone. Dozens of worlds consumed. Infrastructure that no longer existed because the Devourers had eaten it. "Sir, incoming report from Forward Reconnaissance," Communications Officer Bren announced. "Long-range sensors detect a Devourer patrol formation approaching our position. Estimated size, 40 vessels." Alarms began sounding throughout the coalition fleet. On the tactical display, red dots appeared at the edge of sensor range, moving toward them with insect-like precision. "Battle stations," Admiral Corval ordered. "All ships, prepare for defensive formation." Stone stood from his chair with the casual movement of someone completely unimpressed by the situation. "Admiral, with your permission, I'd like to handle this contact personally." "General, 40 enemy ships will serve as an adequate field test." Stone activated his communication device. "Hayes, take Alpha Company and show our coalition friends how Earth handles pest control." Captain Hayes smiled for the first time since boarding the coalition ship. It was not a pleasant expression. "Yes, sir. Rules of engagement. Standard human protocols. If it shoots at you, make it stop existing." Within minutes, a single human transport ship detached from the coalition fleet and accelerated toward the approaching Devourer patrol. Admiral Corval watched through sensor feeds as the small vessel moved to intercept 40 enemy ships. "Sir, shouldn't we provide support?" Lieutenant Zena asked. "Let's see what they can do," Stone replied, settling back into his chair. The engagement lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it ended, debris from 40 Devourer ships drifted in space around one undamaged human transport. Captain Hayes's voice crackled over the communication system. "Contact eliminated. No human casualties. Returning to formation." The coalition command bridge fell completely silent. Admiral Corval stared at the tactical display, trying to process what he had just witnessed. 40 enemy ships that could have destroyed a coalition squadron had been eliminated by a single human unit. "How?" he whispered. General Stone's expression remained unchanged. "We brought the right tools for the job." Through the viewport, more human ships were breaking formation, spreading out like hunters surrounding prey. Admiral Corval realized that the Terra Defense Corps wasn't joining his fleet. They were replacing it. The monsters were no longer in their cage and they had work to do. The main assault began at dawn over the ruined colonies of the Kepler Outer Ring. What had once been thriving worlds now served as breeding grounds for the Devourer swarms. Coalition forces had tried 3 times to retake these systems using standard military doctrine. Each attempt had failed catastrophically. Captain Hayes stood in the briefing room of his transport ship, looking at the tactical hologram of their target. Kepler 7 had been an industrial world with 12 million inhabitants. Now it crawled with Devourer bioforms that had converted the factories into hive complexes. "Sir, Coalition intelligence estimates 40,000 enemy units on the surface," reported Lieutenant Sarah Evans, studying the sensor data. They've fortified the industrial sectors and established breeding chambers in the residential areas. Hayes nodded, his scarred hands tracing attack routes on the display. Standard coalition approach would be surgical strikes to minimize infrastructure damage. And standard coalition approach has failed 3 times, Sergeant Mills added grimly. What's our play, Captain? Hayes smiled, and his soldiers recognized the expression. It was the look their captain wore when he was about to do something that would horrify civilized military observers. We're going to renovate, Hayes announced. Complete urban renewal project. These bugs like the buildings so much will bring the buildings down on their heads. The human assault began with orbital bombardment that made coalition officers physically sick to watch. Instead of precision strikes against military targets, human ships systematically destroyed every structure that could provide cover or resources to the enemy. Factories, warehouses, residential blocks, all reduced to rubble that would be useless to a hive mind that consumed infrastructure. Admiral Corville monitored the attack from his command ship, watching in horror as an entire city vanished beneath clouds of dust and debris. General Stone, your forces are destroying everything. How will we rebuild after the war? Stone's voice carried the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. Admiral, there won't be an after the war, unless we win first. Dead civilizations don't rebuild anything. On the planet's surface, Captain Hayes led his company through the rubble-strewn streets of what had been Kepler-7's capital city. The bombardment had done its job, the neat hive tunnels were collapsed, the breeding chambers were buried, and the surviving devourers were forced into the open where human weapons could find them. Movement 2 o'clock, Private Jessica Morgan called out, raising her gravity hammer. The weapon hummed with contained energy that could crush starship armor. A cluster of devourer bioforms emerged from the ruins, their insectoid bodies gleaming with organic metal plating. They moved with the coordinated precision of a hive mind, flanking maneuvers executed with mathematical perfection. Coalition doctrine would have called for defensive positions and coordinated fire support. Human doctrine was simpler: advance and engage. Morgan's gravity hammer connected with the lead bioform, and the creature simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Her squad didn't take cover, they moved forward, using the enemy's confusion to close distance and maximize damage. These things are tougher than the reports indicated, Sergeant Mills observed, putting 3 pulse rounds into a bioform that continued advancing despite holes punched through its torso. Then we hit them harder, Major Thompson's voice crackled over the communication system. She was leading Bravo Company through the industrial sector, where the heaviest concentrations of enemies had been detected. Thompson's unit encountered their first real resistance at the central processing plant, where Devourer forces had established a command node. The bioforms had positioned themselves in defensive formations around the facility, using the complex's structure to channel attackers into kill zones. Coalition forces would have called for siege equipment and careful tactical planning. Thompson looked at the enemy positions for 30 seconds, then turned to her demolition specialist. Sergeant Cross, how much explosive do you need to bring down this entire complex? Sergeant Major William Cross, 78 years old and still carrying enough firepower to level a city block, grinned through his respirator mask. About half of what I brought, ma'am. Use all of it. The explosion could be seen from orbit. When the smoke cleared, the processing plant and 3 city blocks around it had been reduced to a crater. The Devourer command node, along with roughly 800 bioforms, had been eliminated in a single coordinated detonation. Bravo Company report, Hayes called over the communication system. Command node neutralized, Thompson replied calmly. Moving to secondary objectives. Admiral Corville watched the tactical display as red dots representing enemy forces began disappearing at an alarming rate. Not the gradual attrition of conventional warfare, but the systematic elimination of an entire enemy presence. Sir, we're receiving surrender signals from multiple enemy units, Lieutenant Zena reported, her voice filled with confusion. Surrender signals? General Mortex's scales rippled with disbelief. The Devourers don't surrender. Their hive mind doesn't comprehend the concept. General Stone leaned back in his chair, studying the tactical display with professional satisfaction. It does now. Hive minds are efficient, but they're also logical. When survival becomes mathematically impossible, even insects choose retreat over extinction. On the planet's surface, the remaining Devourer forces were pulling back from their positions, abandoning infrastructure they had spent weeks converting to their needs. The hive mind had calculated the cost of holding Kepler-7 against human forces and determined that the price was too high. Sir, enemy forces are evacuating the planet, Captain Hayes reported. Should we pursue? Negative, Stone replied. Let them run. Let them report back to their main hive what happened here. Major Thompson stood in the ruins of what had been Kepler-7's government district, watching enemy bioforms disappear into the upper atmosphere. Around her, human soldiers moved through the devastation with the methodical efficiency of exterminators completing a job. Ma'am, casualty report. Lieutenant Rogers approached with a data pad. 7 wounded, no fatalities. Enemy casualties estimated at 15,000 confirmed kills. Thompson nodded, already thinking about the next target. This was how humans fought wars, not to preserve pretty cities or maintain civilized conventions, but to win so decisively that the enemy never wanted to fight again. In space above the ruined world, Admiral Corville stared at reports that defied everything he understood about warfare. One day of human military operations had accomplished what 3 coalition campaigns had failed to achieve. The Devourers were retreating, and for the first time in the war they looked afraid. The Devourer retreat began on the 3rd day of human military operations. For the first time in their recorded history, the hive mind species abandoned conquered territory without consuming every available resource. Their bioships fled from human forces with something that looked remarkably like fear. Admiral Corville stood in his command center, watching sensor displays that showed enemy formations breaking apart across 7 star systems. The red dots that had haunted his nightmares for months were disappearing, pulling back toward the galactic rim where they had first emerged. Sir, we're receiving communication from the Devourer main fleet, Lieutenant Zena reported, her voice filled with disbelief. They're requesting negotiation protocols. The bridge fell silent. In 18 months of warfare, the Devourers had never attempted communication. They consumed, they adapted, they advanced. They didn't negotiate. Put it through, Corville ordered. The main screen flickered to life, showing something that barely registered as a living being. The Devourer representative looked like a mixture of insect and machine, its voice a harmony of clicking sounds translated by coalition computers. Coalition forces, we acknowledge superior tactical doctrine. We withdraw from occupied territories. We request cessation of hostilities. General Stone stepped forward, his weathered face showing no emotion. Withdrawal is acceptable. Complete evacuation of all systems within coalition space within 30 standard days. Any Devourer forces remaining after that deadline will be eliminated. The alien representative's compound eyes seemed to focus on Stone with something resembling recognition. Acknowledged, Earth-human. Your species fights differently. The transmission ended, leaving the coalition command staff staring at each other in stunned silence. The war was over. The enemy that had consumed worlds and fleets was retreating because they had encountered something that frightened them more than death. General Stone, Admiral Corville said quietly, how did you know they would surrender? Stone settled into a chair, looking older than his 72 years. Hive minds are logical, Admiral. They calculate cost versus benefit for every action. We made the cost of fighting humans higher than the benefit of conquest. But the casualties, Defense Minister Quinn spoke up. Your forces lost 43 soldiers across all operations. Coalition doctrine assumes much higher losses for successful campaigns. Different species, different acceptable loss ratios, Major Thompson replied from her position near the tactical display. Humans are expendable. We accept that. It makes us more effective in combat. The casual way she discussed human mortality made several coalition officers visibly uncomfortable. Corville realized that this was the fundamental difference between human and civilized warfare. Most species fought to preserve their soldiers. Humans fought to win regardless of cost. Over the following days, the victory celebration felt surreal. Coalition worlds that had prepared for evacuation instead threw festivals honoring their salvation. Representatives from dozens of species offered formal gratitude to the Terra Defense Corps. The humans accepted their thanks with polite professionalism, then began preparations to return to Earth. Captain Hayes supervised the loading of equipment aboard his transport ship. His soldiers moved with the same mechanical efficiency they had shown in combat, but Corville noticed something different in their behavior. They didn't celebrate victory. They maintained weapons, filed reports, and prepared for the next war. Captain, your people don't seem happy about winning, Corville observed. Hayes paused in his inspection of pulse rifles. Admiral, we didn't win. We just solved a problem. Tomorrow there will be different problems. Lieutenant Sarah Evans approached with a data pad containing casualty statistics. Sir, final numbers from all operations. 43 Kia, 112 wounded. Enemy casualties estimated at over 2 million. Hayes nodded, making notes on his personal communicator. Acceptable ratio. Make sure the families receive full benefits packages. Admiral Corval watched this exchange with growing unease. The humans discussed their dead colleagues like equipment that had been damaged during a job. There was sadness in their voices but no surprise. They had expected to lose people, planned for it, accepted it as part of the cost of doing business. General Stone found Corval in the observation lounge, looking out at the stars that were now safe because of human intervention. The old soldier moved carefully, his age showing more clearly now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Admiral, you have something on your mind," Stone observed. "General, your people died for worlds they had never seen, protecting species they barely knew. Why?" Stone was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Because that's what soldiers do. We solve problems that can't be solved with words or negotiations or civilized behavior. Sometimes that costs lives. The math is simple: 43 of ours for the survival of trillions of yours. Will you stay?" Corval asked. "The galaxy could use defenders like you." Stone's smile held no warmth. "Admiral, you called us because you needed monsters to fight monsters. Now that the job is done, you'll sleep better knowing we're back where you can keep an eye on us." The human fleet departed as suddenly as it had arrived. 18 ships carrying soldiers who had saved the galaxy, returning to their exile around Earth. Coalition Command marked the operation as classified, the battle recordings sealed, the tactical doctrine forbidden for study by civilized species. In his final report, Admiral Corval wrote recommendations that would haunt Coalition military planning for generations. The Terra Defense Corps should remain isolated, not to protect the galaxy from humans, but to ensure that humans never decided the Coalition itself was a problem that needed solving. The celebration parties continued for weeks across Coalition space. Children who would have grown up as slaves or food for the Devourers instead played in parks and attended schools. Entire species that had faced extinction now planned for the future. None of them knew that their salvation had come from soldiers who treated death as a tactical option and victory as the only acceptable outcome. The monsters had returned to their cage, but they remained awake, watching, ready for the next time civilization needed to remember why some problems required inhuman solutions. The war was over, but the peace existed only because Earth's soldiers allowed it to exist. In the depths of space, Devourer ships fled toward unknown galaxies, carrying with them the memory of creatures that fought like forces of nature and died like heroes. They would never return to Coalition space, but they would remember the lesson they had learned about the species that called itself human. Some victories come with a price that civilization prefers not to calculate.